Understood. I'll now write section 1 of the story script, faceless style, without headings, no scene labeling, no repetitions, and keeping it direct with tension, quality, and flow. It will run at least 760 words. Clara had grown used to the silence in her marriage, the kind of silence that spread across the house and filled her nights with a hollow ache. Daniel was always gone, buried in late hours, his energy spent before he ever reached her. She no longer waited for him to touch her, no longer hoped he would notice when she slipped into bed in a silk nightgown that used to matter. The body beside her had become nothing more than a reminder of what wasn't there. That void, steady and cold, was the reason she'd started seeking comfort alone, in quiet corners of the night, behind locked doors, in a rhythm that was hers alone. On that particular night, Clara's loneliness had pressed so heavy against her chest that she couldn't hold it back. The house was quiet, Daniel nowhere near, and Ethan was supposed to be asleep. She slipped into her bedroom, closed the door with a gentle push, and let herself unravel. No words, no names, only breath and the sound of sheets shifting under her weight. She let her hands roam, desperate to feel alive again, every nerve stretched and searching. Her body reacted eagerly, as though it had been waiting for permission. She pressed deeper into the sensation, losing herself to the quiet waves she could control, to the heat that only reminded her how neglected she was. She didn't hear the door at first. It was the smallest creak, subtle enough to be lost in the shuffle of her breaths. But then a pause followed, an unnatural pause. She froze, heart crashing against her ribs, and turned her head. The doorway wasn't empty. Ethan stood there. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just locked in place as though the sight had rooted him. Clara's stomach dropped, panic flooding every inch of her, and she yanked the sheets against her body. Her first instinct was shame, pure and raw, the kind that made her throat close up. This was her stepson. This was a line that should have never even been imagined. She should scream, demand he leave, cover herself entirely and bury this moment so deep that neither of them would dare let it rise again. But she couldn't move. The heat that had been building inside her didn't die with the shock, it shifted. Embarrassment tangled with something more dangerous, something she didn't want to admit. His stillness wasn't the stillness of disgust. He wasn't rushing away. He wasn't apologizing. He was watching. That Clara's breath caught, unsteady, and her body betrayed her by reacting, tightening instead of retreating. She pulled the sheets tighter, but not enough to hide everything, not enough to erase what he had already seen. The air grew unbearably thick. She didn't dare speak, and neither did he. Their silence carried more than words ever could, a silence that screamed with things unsaid. The seconds stretched endlessly, and every one of them carved deeper into her, etching the moment into something she knew she'd never forget. Finally, Ethan shifted. His hand moved against the doorframe, uncertain, his jaw tense, but his eyes didn't pull away. Clara's chest rose and fell rapidly, her throat dry as she tried to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't a child. He was a man, younger than her, yes, but his presence carried weight. She'd seen him in the house for months, quiet, respectful, always giving space. But now that space had vanished, replaced with something electric that burned between them. She wanted him gone, desperately, but another part of her, the one that had been starved for so long, felt something else entirely. She couldn't deny the pulse in her body, the lingering echo of her pleasure that refused to fade even as shame tried to smother it. She hated herself for the thought, but she also couldn't stop it. The thrill of being seen, the forbidden nature of it, clawed at her insides until she felt dizzy. Ethan finally stepped back. It was slow, deliberate, his gaze still holding hers as if reluctant to let go. Clara swallowed hard, pressing her lips together, unable to summon words. She watched him retreat, the door easing shut, leaving her alone again. Alone, but not the same. Her chest heaved, her fingers still tangled in the sheets, her body trembling from more than just what she had been doing moments before. When the silence returned fully, it was no longer the silence she had known. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged, loaded with a truth that could never be undone. Clara sank against the pillows, her mind racing with what had just happened. Her body still hummed, furious at her for stopping, but her thoughts screamed louder. She had been caught by Ethan. Not only caught, but watched. And she had let him. She hadn't screamed, hadn't demanded he leave instantly. She had allowed the moment to linger, if only for a breath too long. That breath was enough to change everything. She knew it. He knew it. Even without words, the truth had been exchanged between them. There was no erasing the memory of how she had looked in that vulnerable, raw state, no taking back the way his eyes had held her. The lines that had once kept their relationship neat and safe had blurred in an instant. Clara curled into herself, clutching the sheets until her knuckles turned white. She hated the warmth spreading through her body, the way her skin still tingled. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But it did. It meant everything. And though she wanted to pretend it would fade by morning, a deeper part of her already knew better. That moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but could already feel pulling her in. Word count 772 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to move straight into section 2? 760 words. Next, carrying the tension forward. Understood. I'll continue with section 2 of the story script, faceless style, keeping it tight, direct, and tension-driven, without repetition of section 1, no headings, no filler, and hitting at least 760 words the morning after should have erased it, but it didn't. Clara avoided Ethan at first, moving carefully through the house, waiting until she heard him leave before stepping out of her room. Every sound reminded her of what he'd seen, of how still he had stood, of how she had not forced him away. She wanted to believe he would pretend it hadn't happened. But when they finally crossed paths in the kitchen, the truth was in the air between them, impossible to ignore. He greeted her as usual, polite, casual, but his eyes lingered a fraction too long, and she felt heat rush up her neck. Clara forced a smile, clutched her coffee cup, and turned away too quickly, as though physical distance could undo the charge inside her chest. She could feel his gaze, steady and curious, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The days blurred. They spoke little, but silence carried more weight than words ever could. Every movement, every brush of proximity was amplified. When she reached for a plate and his hand was already there, the accidental touch sent a jolt through her skin. When she leaned over to grab a dish towel and caught him watching in her peripheral vision, her pulse raced. She pretended not to notice, but her body betrayed her every time. That 18 night, when she lay in bed, the memory replayed endlessly. She told herself it was shame that made her restless, shame that had her tossing under the sheets, but in the hollow spaces of her honesty, she knew it wasn't only that. It was the thrill. The thrill of being seen, of being wanted, of having his attention in a way Daniel hadn't given her in years. She hated herself for craving it, but the craving grew anyway. Ethan didn't push, didn't speak of it, but his silence was its own kind of invitation. Clara started noticing the subtle changes in herself, how she lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary if he was there, how she didn't always close her bedroom door fully, how she wore looser tops without a bra and pretended it was simply comfort. She told herself these were coincidences, harmless habits, but deep down, she knew she was testing him, testing herself, testing the fragile line between them. One evening, Daniel called to say he'd be out late again. Clara hung up, her chest tightening, though not with disappointment. She sat on the couch with the television flickering in front of her, though she wasn't watching. Ethan walked in, dropped his bag on the table, and sat across the room. Neither spoke. The quiet dragged, and Clara felt every second etching into her bones. She shifted, crossed her legs, uncrossed them, aware of how visible the gesture was. Ethan's gaze followed, sharp, unflinching. The air between them was alive, heavy, saturated with unspoken things. Clara's throat was dry, her palms damp, but she didn't move away. It was as if both of them were waiting for something, though neither dared to name it. When she finally stood and excused herself, her heart was racing so violently she could barely breathe. She went to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Her body throbbed with restless energy, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her thighs. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. But knowing and resisting were not the same. Clara leaned back against the pillows, her body betraying her resolve, her breath trembling as she let her hand slide down. The door wasn't fully shut this time. She left it cracked, just enough for sound to slip through. Her movements were unsteady at first, fueled by nerves, but the moment the rush of pleasure began to build, she lost herself again. Her breaths grew louder, sharper, echoing in the quiet house. She knew he could hear. She wanted him to. The floor creaked outside her room, faint but undeniable. She stilled for only a second, then continued, faster, louder, reckless. Shame burned her cheeks, but the thrill overpowered it. She imagined him standing just beyond the door, listening, frozen the way he had been before. Her body tightened with the thought, and she gave in, surrendering to the rhythm, to the heat that consumed her. When it was over, her body slackened, trembling, drenched in both release and guilt. She pulled the sheets over herself, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The hallway was silent again. She didn't need to look to know he had been there. The evidence was in the way her heart pounded, in the electric charge lingering in her skin, in the undeniable truth that what she had done was no longer just for herself. It had been for him too. The next morning, Ethan's presence was different. He moved with a quiet confidence, his glances less hesitant, his posture more certain. Clara avoided his eyes, but every time she caught them, she felt the same spark, sharp and intoxicating. The boundary between them had thinned so dangerously that even the simplest gestures carried weight. A hand brushing past hers at the sink. The warmth of his shoulder when he walked behind her. The subtle pause in his step when she bent to pick something up. She told herself she could stop, that it had gone far enough, that she could close the door next time, were something less revealing, stop indulging her loneliness in ways that left her vulnerable. But the truth was already carved deep inside her. She had felt the danger, tasted it, and now it lived under her skin, restless and hungry. She knew this couldn't last, that the line between them wasn't just blurred anymore, it was breaking. And when it finally snapped, there would be no undoing it. Word count 771 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to go ahead and write section 3, 760 words, next, where the act finally happens and the fallout begins? Understood. I'll now write section 3 of the script, keeping it to the point, faceless. No repetitions of earlier sections, no headings, no filler, just direct progression of the act and aftermath. It will be at least 760 words. Clara tried to pretend the house was the same, but it wasn't. Every corner carried the weight of what had already passed between them, even if no words had been spoken. The quiet glances had grown bolder, the tension too thick to ignore. She caught herself waiting for moments when Daniel was gone, almost anticipating Ethan's presence, her body betraying her every time she felt his nearness. She wanted to resist, But each night of pretending only made the hunger worse. The breaking point came on a night when the air was heavy with summer heat and the house seemed too small to contain the pulse running through her veins. Clara sat in her room, restless, unable to settle her thoughts. She didn't start anything this time, she didn't need to. A soft knock came at the door, not tentative, not accidental, but measured, deliberate. Her breath caught, and instead of sending him away, she simply whispered for him to come in. The door opened slowly, and Ethan stepped inside, closing it behind him with care. For a moment, he stood still, waiting for her to object, to push him back into the hallway. She didn't. The silence wrapped around them, alive and dangerous, neither daring to breathe too loud. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as he moved closer, each step a question, each one met with her failure to resist. When his hand brushed hers, the world tilted. She should have pulled away, but she didn't. Instead, her fingers tightened, holding him there, acknowledging everything they had avoided saying. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin, and she let him touch her. The contact was simple at first, just the slide of his hand over hers, but it lit her up from the inside. She trembled, caught between guilt and need, but the need was stronger. Her body gave in before her mind could stop it. His touch grew firmer, exploratory, unhurried but certain, and she gasped, the sound breaking the silence like glass. Clara's chest rose sharply, her hand gripping his arm as if to anchor herself, though she knew she was already lost. She had told herself for days that this could never happen, that she would never let it, but now that it was here, resistance dissolved into nothing. Every movement was faceless, wordless, guided by instinct. His hands learned her in ways Daniel hadn't in years, attentive, deliberate, unashamed. Her breath quickened, her body arching toward him, helpless against the fire he stoked with every careful touch. She closed her eyes, surrendering, too consumed to care about the consequences. The rhythm between them built swiftly, a current neither could control. Clara clung to him, desperate, the weight of years of neglect crashing down in a single flood of release. The sound of her breaths, the press of skin against skin, the way her body responded, every detail seared itself into the moment, a forbidden truth too powerful to be denied. Her mind screamed of betrayal, but her body only begged for more. When it finally broke, when the tension snapped and she gave in fully, Clara cried out, muffling herself against his shoulder, every nerve shattering under the force of it. Ethan held her, steady, his own body trembling with the same urgency, and together they fell into the silence afterward, panting, shaken, undone. The room was hot with the aftermath, the sheets twisted, the air heavy with what they had done. Clara lay back, her chest rising in ragged waves, her hand still gripping his as if she feared letting go would make it real. Her thoughts spun wildly, shame, relief, hunger, fear, all tangled into one unbearable knot. She turned her face into the pillow, unable to look at him, unable to accept what it meant. Ethan didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't try to explain. He simply stayed there for a moment, his breathing slowly settling, his hand still brushing hers as though to remind her it wasn't just in her imagination. Then, with a quiet movement, he rose, pulled the sheets back over her trembling body, and left without a word. The door clicked shut, but the silence he left behind was deafening. Clara lay awake long after, staring into the darkness, her skin still tingling from his touch. She wanted to deny it, to convince herself it was a mistake born of weakness, a single night that could be buried. But the memory was burned too deep, her body still aching for more even as guilt gnawed at her conscience. She thought of Daniel, thought of the years she had spent waiting for him, thought of how quickly she had crossed the line once someone else noticed her. By morning, nothing had changed on the surface. The house looked the same, the sun streamed through the curtains, and Daniel remained distant, distracted, unaware. But inside her, everything was altered. Every sound of Ethan's footsteps carried a new weight. Every shared glance felt loaded with the memory of what they had done. She could not look at him without remembering the way he had touched her, the way she had let him. She moved through the day in silence, keeping her distance, though it was impossible to erase what bound them now. Clara knew there was no undoing it. She could tell herself it was only once, only a slip, but the truth pressed too firmly against her chest. The secret belonged to both of them now, tying them together in ways that could never be spoken, never confessed. The guilt remained sharp, but so did the hunger. That was the worst part. She had tasted what had been missing for so long, and she knew part of her would crave it again, no matter how dangerous it was. She closed her eyes, pressed her hand against her mouth, and swallowed the sob that threatened to escape. What they had done could never be known, never be undone. It was theirs alone, a truth she would carry forever, heavy and intoxicating, a betrayal etched into her skin. Word count 774 white heavy checkmark. This completes the full 3-section, 2,000 plus word script based on your requested outline. Would you like me to now create the final title and description in a polished way for the story, like a video/story metadata style? Got it. I'll now extend the story with section 4, keeping the same quality, a faceless style, no headings, no repetitions of earlier sections, sharp flow, and at least 760 words. This will move deeper into the emotional aftermath, secrecy, and the dangerous bond between Clara and Ethan. Clara thought the weight of what they had done would break her, but instead it wrapped around her like a second skin, suffocating yet impossible to peel away. The next days were unbearable in their normalcy. Daniel came home late as always, slipping into bed without noticing her stiffness, without sensing the storm beneath her calm surface. She looked at him and wondered how she could have betrayed him so completely, and yet when her mind drifted back to Ethan, the guilt was tangled with something darker, desire that hadn't burned out, only deepened. Ethan moved differently now. He wasn't careless, but he no longer carried the hesitance of before. His gaze met hers with a steadiness that unsettled her. In the morning, when they crossed paths in the hallway, his eyes brushed over her body in a way that left her trembling, though no words were exchanged. In the kitchen, his arm grazed her shoulder deliberately when reaching for a glass, and she felt the spark travel straight down her spine. These small touches should have been meaningless, yet they left her dizzy, replaying them long after he left the room. 18 night, Clara lay awake beside Daniel, her back turned to him, her body remembering Ethan's hands instead. Every sound in the house sharpened her awareness, every creak of the floorboards making her wonder if Ethan was awake too, if he thought of her in the same restless way. She closed her eyes and clenched her fists, trying to bury the thoughts, but they came back each time with more force. The secrecy became its own addiction. Passing in the hallway and pretending not to notice his nearness thrilled her as much as it frightened her. She hated the way her breath caught when she heard him showering, the way she lingered near the closed bathroom door, furious at herself for even imagining what lay behind it. She caught glimpses of him shirtless when he thought no one was looking, and each time she forced herself to look away, though her body responded regardless. Hungry and disobedient, Clara told herself she wouldn't let it happen again, that the one night had been enough, too much, already a line that could never be crossed twice. But temptation didn't fade. Instead, it gnawed at her in the quiet hours, building until the restraint itself became unbearable. She tried to distract herself with errands, with long showers, with empty conversations with Daniel, but nothing quieted the ache that had lodged inside her. One evening, Daniel left for another overnight trip, his bag packed and his kiss absent-minded. Clara watched him drive away, her chest tight, her hands trembling. She knew she should feel relief, a reprieve from her guilt, but instead she felt the familiar thrum of danger rise in her chest. The house was theirs again, hers and Ethan's, and the knowledge unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She sat in the living room, a book open in her lap, though the words blurred. The silence pressed in on her until the sound of footsteps broke it. Ethan entered casually, a glass of water in his hand, and paused when he saw her. His eyes lingered, steady, unreadable, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then he sat across from her, setting the glass on the table with deliberate care. The air pulsed between them. Clara's heart pounded, her throat dry, her body tense. She wanted to speak, to remind him of boundaries, but the words refused to form. Instead, she shifted slightly, her knee brushing against his as though by accident. His stillness told her he knew it wasn't. Every inch of space between them felt alive, electric. Clara's breath quickened, and she finally rose, setting the book aside. She told herself she was leaving, escaping before the inevitable happened again, but when she reached the doorway she didn't keep walking. She paused. Ethan followed, his presence close behind, and she felt his hand graze her wrist. She froze, eyes closing as heat rushed through her body. She should have pulled away. She didn't. What followed wasn't rushed but inevitable. Their hands found each other again, their bodies closing the gap, and the silence filled with the sound of their unsteady breaths. Clara surrendered, letting him lead her back into the tide she had sworn she would never return to. Every touch was heavier now, every movement driven by memory and hunger, as if the first time had only been a beginning. Her guilt screamed inside her, but her body ignored it, clinging to him with desperate need. When it was over, the silence returned, thicker than before. Clara lay against him for a moment, her chest still heaving, her skin damp, her thoughts a storm she couldn't calm. Then she pulled away abruptly, clutching the sheets to her body, her heart breaking with the weight of what she'd allowed. Ethan didn't speak. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Before rising and slipping out of the room, left alone, Clara pressed her hands to her face, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to hate him, to hate herself, but instead she felt the unbearable truth settle deeper inside her. This wasn't going to stop. She had crossed the line once and then again, and each time only made the hunger stronger. She knew it was wrong, unforgivable, destructive, but knowing didn't change the pull. Clara lay back, staring at the ceiling, every nerve still alive with what had just happened. She told herself this would be the last time, that she would lock her doors, avoid him, confess nothing, bury it all beneath layers of silence. But even as she whispered those promises to herself, she knew they were lies. What she had unleashed couldn't be contained. Ethan had become the echo in every quiet moment, the ghost in every thought, the secret she both feared and craved. And no matter how hard she tried, there was no going back. Word count 772 white heavy check mark. Do you want me to keep extending with section 5 as well? Or should I now create the final polished title and description for the complete story?